Giulia Sissa is professor of Greek literature and religion, ancient political theory, and gender studies at UCLA, where she holds a joint appointment in classics and political science. Giulia is the author of many books and articles on the history, anthropology, and philosophy of the ancient world, and especially on the connection of antiquity to major contemporary issues, including feminism, sexuality, democratic theory, utopianism, and political emotions. She's currently working on ancient democracy and imperialism, on politics and the passions, and on the political pursuit of pleasure from Athens to utopia. Her talk today, part of a larger project, is on anesthetic humanism, conflicting ethics of pleasure and pain.
Thank you. We desire, the desire of others. We hope to become its object. Love longs for reciprocity. Reciprocity makes possible recognition, gratitude, and erotic dignity. From Euripides to Ovid to Stendhal, the greatest theorists of love, tell us these simple things which we experience anyway in our life. Now, contemporary philosophy resists thinking reciprocity. In Le Don des Philosophes, Marcel Enaff shows the strange obstinacy of today's moralists in denying dialectical exchange, to give, to receive, and to give back, which anthropology places, on the contrary, at the heart of the social bond. A gift must be completely disinterested. If you give and you anticipate to receive, you do not really give. Now, there is something naive and overly demanding in these normative positions. The experience of love helps us to understand, however, that to open up to another, to offer care, tenderness, fun, presence, compliments, means to engage in a relationship that is singular. By these gestures and words, we compose an encounter that individualizes the recipient with the living being, not necessarily human. Once we have identified this singular object of our desire, we want for them to do the same. And if we have been loved first, how ungracious not to pretend, at least, to be flattered. Contemporary philosophy is also keen on intersubjectivity. Despite the final criticism by Jacques Lacan in 1960, this idea resurfaces again and again, especially in feminist theory. Lacan had initially excoriated the attempt to reduce the analytic situation to an intersubjective relationship. This pious intent missed, he said, the structural disparity of transference. Lacan then rejected the idea of oblativity, this highly moral prototype of old issues, vieilles questions. You must treat the other person as a subject, not as an object. This is an ethical posture that for Lacan belonged to the existential analytic vocabulary of the time, the 60s. It was not just a fashion, but a mistake. Above all, such language created for Lacan a misunderstanding about the place of the object of desire. I quote, "If we do make a person into an object," said Lacan, "it will be any old object, an object like any other object, an object that can be rejected, exchanged. In short, it, the person made into an object, will be deeply devalued." That is the theme underlying the idea of oblativity. And against this silliness, said niaiserie, Lacan made two arguments. The first argument was that the word object, in his primary sense, aims at objects insofar as we distinguish them and can communicate. Desire, for Lacan, enhances, accentuates, accentue an object in relation to another object. Desire draws lines of demarcation. Speaking of objects means talking of the distinctive effects of desire. The second argument was that, paradoxically, I quote, for the subject, it is much worse. Because a subject for Lacan was defined by his submission to language. A subject does not occupy, in other words, a position of dominance and control. The subject is unconscious, or more precisely, quote, in the subject there is a part where it speaks all by itself, no sovereignty. Now, to these critics, I would like to add a few considerations which relate to contemporary debates. The polarity of subject-object produces absurd effects, both ethical and erotic. I mean that we are now ready to shed the all too familiar notion of sexual object. An American philosopher whose influence is now felt in Europe, Martha Nussbaum, has compiled a list of ways in which we may objectify a human being. These are, as you certainly know, to treat a person as a means to our ends, as if she were devoid of autonomy and a sphere of action of her own, as if she were interchangeable with other objects, as we did not respect their integrity, as if she were a commodity. Indifference to the experiences and feelings of a person, this is to say, the denial of her subjectivity, crowns this catalogue of manners of looking at others as object. Ray Langton adds the reduction of a subject person to a body or body parts or their appearance and the attempt to silence them. Because the sexual act involves my pleasure, it might appear to exploit another body to this effect. Eros is then the first culprit of objectification, reification. Nussbaum notoriously forgives the literary eroticism of Lady Chatterley's lover, but not that of Playboy. And even she admits that sometimes she happens to lay her head on the belly of her lover without treating him exclusively and forever as a cushion. As the involvement of the beloved abdomen occurs in a context of respect, it is permitted. No objectification, no reification in this case. Now, this daring confection is just a concession, however, within a Kantian vocabulary which remains unquestioned. The Kantian frame is upheld and defended by a number of moral philosophers, such as Barbara Herrmann today. This language has crept into many philosophical but also ordinary idioms in the 20th century. How did it happen? The human being is not a thing. For Kant, sexuality belongs in a wide and fundamental ethical scheme. We must relate to rational beings as ends, not as means. Means are things, people are ends. This distinction generates all the laws of the will. I quote, "The practical imperative will therefore be the following: act so that you treat humanity in yourself as well as in any other person, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means," end quote. A human being is not a thing. This absolute principle compels us to condemn the reduction of others and ourselves to the status of things more or less useful, inert, exchangeable, replaceable, disposable things, goods to enjoy piece by piece. As soon as another exists or interacts with me according to my wish, desire, or pleasure, this contravenes the categorical imperative and is therefore immoral. Now, sexuality is part of this elementary logic. Kant defines sexual intercourse notoriously as the reciprocal use, Gebrauch, a man can make of the sexual organs and faculties of another person, and such use is either natural if it procreates or is contrary to nature, and it can occur either with a person of the same sex or with an animal of another species. These transgressions of the law, these vices contrary to nature, which we call unspeakable, are offenses to humanity in our own person. No restriction or exception could possibly protect them from total disapproval. Now, the natural character of heterosexuality depends on its purpose, procreation. Only the matrimonial contract makes sex legitimate. And in non-procreative usage of the sexual parts, including one's own, affects nothing less than a person's humanity. Masturbation is worse than suicide. Any sexual act, whatever it is defined as the handling of organs, which means instruments, which means the manipulation of things. I quote again, the natural use of one sex makes of the sexual organs of the other is a pleasure for which each partner is engaged to another. In this act, a man makes a thing of himself, which contradicts the law of humanity in his own person. So the real reification here, making oneself into a thing that is a sexual act, can only be offset by its repetition in an immediate reciprocity. The members of a couple practice the mutual use of their bodies, thus becoming a thing for each other. Two things make a person. I win back my personality, says Kant, if once acquired by another as if I were a thing, I treat the other in turn and in return as a thing. More to the point, the use of organs, that is to say, body parts, commits me to regain my integrity. Since the person is an absolute unity, the usage, acquisition of a member of their body requires the usage, acquisition of the entire person. I must contextualize sex, therefore, in a monogamous marriage, the only guarantee of perfect and lasting reciprocity in use and possession. Marriage confers a real right for Kant. If one partner elopes, the other has the right to reclaim her, him, but mainly her, as if it was a thing. Now, we must take stock of the intransigence that runs through this language. Sex is immoral because it undermines the humanity in the person. Desire and pleasure lower us at the level of the animal, and in most erotic situations, they lead us further down in this very vertical vision of the world. Because sexual desire is not the attraction of a human being to another human being as such, but a penchant for the sex of the other, this desire causes the degradation in Niedrigung of humanity. The desire that man has for a woman, I quote, is not directed towards her because she is a human being, but because she is a woman. The fact that she is a human being has no interest for the man. Only sex is the object of his desire. Humanity is thus debased and subordinate. This is why all men and women do their best not to improve as persons, but to make themselves more attractive. Human quality is literally sacrificed to sex. So if a man wants to satisfy his desire and a woman her own, They try to excite each other. Their inclinations meet, but their purpose is only sex, and each dishonors and hurts the humanity of the other. They make humanity a mere instrumental tool for the satisfaction of their desires and dishonor again it by placing it at the same level as the animal nature. Sexual desire, therefore, exposes humanity to the danger of becoming equal to the animal, end quote. Now, this danger comes to its realization in extramarital sex for Kant. And there is even worse. Sex against nature goes against the animal itself. Masturbation, as I said, is for a human being not only degradation, but a pollution, a debasement of humanity in one's own person. Therefore, the pleasure of the flesh, namely voluptuous pleasure, when it is sought independently of reproductive purposes, becomes unnatural. More specifically, pleasure is contrary to nature whenever it is pursued, not for the sake of a real object, but of an imaginary one, so no fantasy. In masturbation, but also in homosexuality and bestiality, man descends below animality. These forms of sexual desire make a human being not only unworthy of his, mostly his, humanity, for man ceases to be a person, but lower than the beast. Non-human animals, according to Kant, do not mate outside their species, so they are better than certain human beings. So we must grasp, in addition to the intransigence, the resonance of this language with the Christian discourse on sexuality. Kant replaces the kingdom of heaven with the kingdom of ends. Reason, he says, leads us to moral duty. Revealed religion, however, performs the same edification by other means, such as scriptural narratives, which are good enough for ordinary people. The story that Christ was born of a virgin and thanks to a virginal conception is consistent with an undeniable moral impulse. God, who in becoming incarnate must not share the human penchant for evil, could not possibly come to life through sexual intercourse. This impossibility depends upon the evil inherent in the sexual act. I quote, "Because natural procreation is always related to the sensual pleasure of a couple, and because, for the dignity of humanity, it seems to draw too close a relationship between us and the animal species in general, for this reason we consider natural procreation as something that we should blush at." The sexual act is immoral and incompatible with the perfection of man. End quote. Not to mention God. The biblical narrative of original sin and the expulsion from paradise expresses this ethical intuition by telling us that Adam and Eve transmitted a bad inheritance to their descendants. The church has institutionalized the same intuition in the practice of monastic celibacy. So, degradation, humiliation, disgrace, defilement, sacrifice of humanity. Sex is dehumanizing, animalizing, objectifying, reifying. Sex transforms us into beasts and even sub-beasts. Below the sub-animals, for Kant, there are things. Now, forgive me for insisting, but let me emphasize in this genealogy, let me emphasize again that there is no redemption, not even for conjugal sex. By definition, as we have seen, the enjoyment of the other is the mere usage of anatomical parts made acceptable only if the other does the same by using the corresponding parts of my body. The person is saved, paradoxically, only if I push to the extreme this symmetrical reification, which is also a total possession. Als eine Sache is a thing. This is how I belong, and I possess, and I use, and I'm used. Intercourse may be balanced in monogamous marriage, but in no way can it be valued. Chastity is a categorical virtue. It is the duty of man to himself. If the law does not frame the domestic and procreative purpose, then pleasure between men and women becomes a vice. Prostitution, concubinage, and vaga libido are nothing but appetite for a flesh which is just meat. Again, the logic that organizes the argument and runs through the metaphors is inflexible. A man is not his own property. He has no right to sell an organ, not even one of his teeth. For a person to be used by another as the object of satisfaction of sexual desire, therefore to agree to become the object of the other's desire, means to treat oneself as a thing. One allows oneself to become a Sache, a thing, on which another satisfies his appetite, his hunger, as he would satisfy his appetite, his hunger for roast veal. Kalbsbraten. Now, with her concern for the belly pillow of her lover, Martha Nussbaum operates within this same formatting of the erotic situation. Sex can be justified, permitted, condoned, provided that I treat the other person as a person, and vice versa. Object of sexual desire equals sexual thing. But I argue this is wrong. The erotic situation is a body reaching out to another body. A body is never a thing. Desire clings to parts and places, bits and pieces indeed, but above all, it responds to movements and postures, attitudes and gestures, which have nothing to do with things. This way of walking tells me the vitality and energy of my beloved. These eyes I look into twinkle with complicity. This lobe I chew is not a bit of scallopina. When reading Immanuel Kant, I can only long for Stendhal or Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Where is erotic sex here? Enjoyment is a sensation, not a usage. The flesh is irreducible to anatomy and physiology, or even less to the Sunday roast. And above all, we badly need psychoanalysis. We need a scholarly discourse that touches the real of eros, not the real as waste, the real as material, the real as tool, but the real experience, sensation, feeling of enjoyment. When I desire, I do exactly the opposite of what it is meant by objectification. I single out the special features of the other person, including her, his lively, expressive, intentional body. I accentuate the singularity, Lacan would say. I hyper-personify the other person, I will add. I project intentionality onto their body. He looks at me, she smiled. He turns around, she beckoned me. Careful and apprehensive, my desire guesses and amplifies the desire of the other. Eroticism does not deal with organs, but with partial objects that signify, not with the wish to regain a lost personality, but with attention to the sensual singularity of the other and of myself. There is no use, again, there are sensations. When I'm desired, I do, again, the opposite of self-objectification. I'm not a thing, but a cause, Lacan again, cause of desire and pleasure. I dress and perform my erotic persona in order to signify my desire or the absence thereof. I'm not an absolute unity, but an unconscious subject who does not know exactly why it has to be this or that which makes me feel. I'm not, finally, a person whose humanity would be violated by the pleasure of another. I feel a pleasure which is good and which makes me feel good. I have nothing to lose. I have nothing to fear. What preserves us from the meaty exploitation of others' body is eroticism. Arts of love deploy ways to enjoy in detail, to offer one's own body in so many fashions to the pleasures of others. Social graces, erotic graces. Thus, it is perhaps reflecting on the context of our interpersonal relations that I allow myself to lay my head, sorry darling, on the belly of my lover, but making love is something else. Eros is otherwise demanding. He wants a living and renewed desire. We entwine with others in order to experience pleasant and thrilling, intense and beautiful, again, sensations. This is the end, no procreation. If this is the end, it is necessary to experiment, vary, discover, and rediscover. It is taking the liberty to isolate the caress of this hand, the sound of this voice, the smell of this skin that I will feel, perhaps something erotic. And the other, a particular person with fantasies of his, her own, will want me to do silly little things that trigger their erotic response. Sensuality demands the opposite, again, of a reasonable context. It might be weird, ritualized, perverse, embarrassing. We actually disconnect, and we do not make one either. We cling piecemeal in surprising microshocks. Whatever happens outside, here and now, only pleasures matter. Of course, when we talk about pleasure as an end, not as a means, it is the antithesis of a morality based entirely on contempt for the useful and the pleasant in the tradition of Stoicism, and of a torture Epicureanism, as we will see in a moment. It is also very far from a feminist theory that needs to condone eroticism on behalf of some higher, more legitimate ends, such as flourishing, the new categorical imperative. It is not sex that instrumentalizes persons, it is Kant who instrumentalizes sex. Now, there are many ways out of the Kantian kingdom of ends. One is Hegel, of course. We learn to talk about recognition, not objectification, with Hegel, dialectic, not opposition between subject and object, of relationships between people, not between people and things. Hegel discusses sex and family formation in the Principles of Philosophy of Law. From the outset, he attacks Kant. He accuses Kant of thinking of marriage in a way that falls within shame, it must be said. And he uses exactly the same word that Kant used in order to cast sexuality as precisely ignominious. Kant's thought, he fulminates, is shame. This thought was haunted by the defilement, Schandung, of humanity in the person, as we have seen, but it is not itself but a form of Schandlichkeit for Hegel. Hegel's criticism is violent. Now, why such violence? Well, because Kant makes a category mistake for Hegel. He has subsumed marriage under the concept of contract, but a contract, says Hegel, is defined as a transaction between two wills, that is to say, two free persons who alienate, acquire, exchange a thing, Sache. Marriage has nothing to do with such definition. The union of man and woman creates a unit for Hegel. Two individuals form a society which is itself a moral person. The specificity of this union is love and reciprocal devotion, not use. Be it arranged by families or the culmination of passion between two individuals, marriage becomes the unit of natural sexes in a spiritual and conscious love. There is absolutely no transfer of objects or things here. There is no mutual usage of organs. Hegel rejects the language of machinery and butchering. This could not be more clear. Marriage is not meant to ratify the reciprocal use of the sexual organs between two partners who treat each other as a thing. Marriage unites two people as persons. Hegel, therefore, says exactly this. One has to abandon the point of view of contract and understand that marriage is the opposite of what Kant had claimed. There is no transfer of ownership, there is no reification again, no possession, no usage, no things. Now, Hegel points out a category mistake. Marriage must not be confused with a contract. We can see another mistake here, which is even more significant, in my opinion. The confusion between an object of, on the one hand, and an object understood as a thing, on the other hand. We do not need, in fact, to conflate an inanimate, inert, tangible, interchangeable, available, consumable, and ready-made object thing with an object of. In the philosophical tradition, as well as in ordinary language, the word object does not have to refer to an ontological category. This is a thing, this is a person, but to a relative position with respect to a subject. Descartes, for example, commonly evoked objects of sense, vision, love, admiration. Object of designates just a place that anyone and anything can occupy. It is not because I place a person or even God at the center of my visual field as the recipient of my curiosity, attention, respect, and love that I convert that object of into a thing. On the contrary, I value them. I may attribute to them extraordinary charms. Stendhal would say that I crystallize. Jacques Lacan, as we have seen, emphasizes the differential effect of desire. What that object cause does to me sets it apart, sans balance. And above all, if I desire, I will lend to that object a lively desire for me. As I said, I hyper-personify. The neo-Kantian argument takes for granted that if I desire you, just because you are in the accusative, desire imposes onto you an ontological status. Along these lines, Lucy Irigaray suggests, let us declare our love by saying, j'aime à toi, I love to you, in order to avoid saying, je t'aime, I love you. You will then not be treated linguistically as an object, passive and thingy, but my question is, does the dative make a real difference? What makes a difference is the propositional awareness that an object of implies that there are sensations, perceptions, sentiments, intentions, of which a person is the cause. The object becomes just that of which there is sensation. It becomes that which is capable of creating a sensation for me. And those sensations do not care for things, but for other sensations. But it is true that if I hate bodily pleasure, then yes, certainly I will accuse desire itself of transforming its objects and its causes into mere things. I will accuse desire itself, in other words, of objectifying everything it touches. Kant does exactly that in the passage on the roast veal. It is a moral posture of disapproval adopted a priori that generates the rhetorical strategy that leads to the conflation of both senses of the word object. It is the systematic blame of pleasure, a blame at work in every sentence, word, and syllable of Kantian anesthetic humanism that reduces Eros to hunger for inhuman meat. Now another way of rescuing Eros for the kingdom of ends is to return to the poets, our poets, one in particular of it. In the Amores, the poet experienced love, he says, but already theorized it. In the poem, which can be considered the manifesto of the collection 2-4, the poet admits not simply that in every woman there is a little something that will touch him, but he deploys his linguistic creativity by changing the idiosyncrasies of each woman that others might consider defects into causes of desires for him. This is an exercise in imagination, of course, but also in attribution and almost translation. His desire does not simply move from woman to woman, but from detail to detail. His love, the poet says, is ambitious, ambitiosus, eager, including, encompassing. Anything is a sufficient cause for him to be touched. Causa tangor ab omni. I quote, "There is no certain beauty that invites my loves. There are 100 causes which make me love always. Non est certa meosque forma invitet amores, centum sunt causae." Variety is consistent with continuity. What acts on the poet is not a certa forma. It is not the objective and undeniable shape, beauty of a whole body, but literally a cause of desire, a causa as uncertain and subjective as it is powerful. Every detail becomes erotically significant because a woman is trying to please, for instance, by applying herself to cultus, dance, songs, poetry, or because the poet himself embellishes an aspect of hers by anticipating its erotic effects upon his imagination and hope. If a woman turns her modest eyes to the ground, I burn, and that modesty is my temptations. If a woman is shameless, I'm taken, because she is not rough and makes me hope that she will keep moving in a soft bed. If one appears to be severe and to imitate the stern Sabines, I want her, but I believe that she pretends out of haughtiness. Desire is optative. She is not cultured, let her come, so that she will have the chance to become cultured. She walks softly, she takes me because of her motion. Another one is rigid. Oh, might she be softer once she touches a man? The perception of the point of attraction in every woman may become a compliment addressed to her. You, because you are so tall, you match the ancient heroines, and you can, in your abundance, spread out on the entire surface of the bed. If you are educated, you please gifted for rare arts. If you are rough, you are appreciated because of your simplicity. All these bits and pieces of the body, hair, fingers, eyes, hands, arms, sides, might be seen as a collection of anatomical pieces for a priapic desire that targets a woman, not as a person in her entirety, but a dismembered things. But what to make of the gestures if we take that kind of reading through the lens of objectification? What to make of the gestures, the voice, the gaze, the manners of moving? What to make of the intellectual qualities or of the character outlined in a few traits? And how about the prism of literature and art through which Ovid, like so many other writers, think of Proust and on Odette, as a Botticelli figure, sees a lover's feature? So much more than the body is eroticized. Amor brings everything to life, and far from turning a human being into a thing, it projects desire and motion onto a potential lover who, although unpromisingly stiff or uncompromisingly austere, is imagined hopefully and confidently as mobile and desiring in bed. The partial perspective one has on a body creates again a lively and interacting person in bed. Certainly, the bed is an erotic situation. One has to accept that. Now, Ovid meets Lacan here. Woman does not exist. Woman is not all. There are innumerable small a's, partial, minimal, and virtually insignificant, but actually distinctive traits to which desire sticks. Objects of desire become significant because of those distinctive traits. Objects are fashioned by language, and desire is metonymic. The part stands for the whole. As the preceptor Amoris will claim in the Ars Amatoria, nominibus licet mollire mala. Now, Ovid's theory of love must be read against the background of Lucretius. De Rerum Natura, Book 4, is the place where Lucretius theorizes love, as you all know. For Lucretius, sexual contact is a matter of chance and shocks. To feel erotic attraction means to be struck by a corporeal image, a simulacrum, which excites the body and hurts the soul. It is a fortuitous clash which occurs because simulacra are detached from the bodies as very subtle material films. They travel in the air and come across other bodies. The effect of such a stumbling upon is a mechanical reaction. The blow provokes the ejection of seed from the body that receives a hit towards the body, the simulacrum of which is responsible for that hit. In the same way, blood will spring from a lesion to the flesh right in the face of the author of that lesion. This is desire, haec Venus est nobis. If desire insists on the same object, Lucretius goes on, the wound gets exacerbated. We fall in love. Inflammation and pain, then attachment and obsession, blindness and foolish idealization, disappointment, waste of time, jealousy, a complete disaster. Distraction is now called for as soon as possible. We need other bodies in which to redirect the seed. The whole theory is tailor-made on the male body. We must vitare amorem and keep swinging with pure venereal pleasure in a moving world. You are going to suffer, Lucretius threatens, if you don't change that old wound with new wounds. If you don't go wandering, vagos, pursuing, volgivaga Venus. Now this is reification. to claim that Venus is nothing else than light films hitting the material texture of the soul, thus causing the projection of seed, to say that love is but the aging of a wound, a pathological turn of events that we must forestall as soon as possible by drifting towards other bodies with no attention whatsoever to the individual and intentional, personal dimension of those bodies, to insist that whatever a lover may say about a beloved, it can only be the misled distortion of a physical defect. This is reification. Lucretian bodies are indeed made into things by the narrative and by the prescription, the poetry itself. Love is a wandering thing, if I may. And Kant liked Lucretius. It is precisely in the passage I have just quoted, more or less, that Kant found the striking, unusual expression, Venus Volgivaga. This expression that Kant uses in his arguments on sexuality. I quote, "Natural sexual union takes place either in accordance with mere animal nature, bracket, vaga libido, Venus Volgivaga, fornicatio, close bracket, or in accordance with law," end quote. And this is the same chapter where we find the definition of the sexual act as reciprocal use. Now, Hegel, interestingly, responds to Kant, and he uses in turn the expression Venus vaga. Marriage is in essence an ethical tie, I'm quoting, formerly, especially in most systems of natural law, attention was paid only to the physical side of marriage or to its natural character. Consequently, it was treated only as a sex relationship, and this completely barred the way to its other characteristics. This is crude enough, but it is no less so to think of it as only a civil contract, and even Kant does this. So Kant is just one little nuance less crude than the first level of pure sex. On this view, the parties are bound by a contract of mutual caprice, and marriage is thus degraded to the level of a contract for reciprocal use. Hegel calls sexual coition in this context Venus vaga. The mention of Kant and his crude, contractual, instrumental vision of marriage makes clear that Hegel is thinking here precisely of the Kantian opposition of marriage as a contract and sex as reciprocal use of the sexual organs. Hegel will add his own higher conception of a union between two persons. So we owe to Immanuel Kant the invention of reification. Is feminist theory deliberately Kantian? In order to understand this transmission, we have to take a short detour via Paris at the end of the 40s. But I think it's too late to do so, so I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I'll never read Kant the same. I don't know exactly how to phrase this, but it seems to me that you've read Kant as giving us, say, McKinnon's theory of pornography. So he understands sex always as pornographic.
That's the genealogy.
That's the
genealogy.
Okay. So then I'm really curious if you yourself have a theory of pornography that is not Kantian.
Okay.
I mean, thank you.
Let me start with a response as if I were really the silliest of Socrates' interlocutors, the one who see only the plural and never wants to go for the definition. Okay. So if we talk about pornographies, and if you concede that we can go from the request for a definition to a variety. If we talk about pornographies, I think that not all pornographies deserve to be treated as degradation. I think that there are, if we are in the plural and we open up to the possibility of redefining manners of looking at bodies, recognizing the pleasure of the looking for different viewers, and I would place women at the beginning, women looking at women, men looking at men, and also women looking at men and men looking at women. I wouldn't follow this precisely, this monolithic idea of objectification, reification, violence at any price. I think there is space for a plural aesthetics and a plural way of articulating gaze and pleasure and desire. But, you know, I know that this is an incredibly controversial question. And I didn't go into really the polyphony of the discussion on this question of objectification. Pornography, yes, but not only pornography, but objectification itself. I think, for instance, that the work of Anne Cahill is extremely interesting, the way she criticizes all this thinking, all this language of objectification, introducing her notion of derivatization. It's a way of going back to Merleau-Ponty, because all this is already in Merleau-Ponty. All this is already in Merleau-Ponty. And trying somehow cautiously to bring back that voice, that phenomenology. And I think that that's the way to go. The way to go is to go for bodies between things and persons, and to go for bodies that are made of bits and pieces. Body have never been thought as one piece. And this is so important theoretically. I mean, we don't need to wait for Lacan to tell us this, but of course Lacan tells us this in a more picturesque manner than others, and puts the accent on that. So in a sense, the tour via Paris, for me, is a way of rereading Simone de Beauvoir, because Simone de Beauvoir is really the founder. She is the one who has canonized and codified this language of objectification. And she did it in a context which has been incredibly well understood by Althusser, by Louis Althusser. Althusser, I think, has done something incredibly daring in Poor Marx, this book in '65, in which he says, what people don't understand is that Marx was a Kantian before being Hegelian. And all the fashion of objectification and reification, which is the massive, language of German sociology, as we all know, actually is for Althusser says, is again a category mistake. And it's also a bad reading of Marx, is to take the Marx pre-Hegelian, the Kantian Marx, and not understanding what will happen in the capital, not understanding that Marx will abandon completely that humanism. But in the meantime, the entire tradition of thinking and speaking in terms of reification, objectification has taken off. And one of the persons who have completely embraced this language, notwithstanding her Hegelian allegiance, is precisely Simone de Beauvoir. So I think that something very interesting has happened at the time that we can understand surprisingly well by reading Althusser, who was very, very skeptical about this whole operation based on a Kantian Marx. I think that, of course, Simone de Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty were very, very close to each other. The phenomenology of perception is an incredibly richer, more interesting, and more promising for feminist theory kind of thinking that we can read today. And I have the impression that there is a sort of rediscovery of Merleau-Ponty, and I can only applaud because he is so rich. And, you know, if we think with his help, all this is, in a sense, undermined and vanified, because anyway, as Merleau-Ponty says, I'm never a thing, I cannot be a thing. There is always an intention that escapes me. And especially in a sexual situation, I can never be a thing. Even if I want it, I can't. So, I mean, it's eyes-opening, I find. I think there was, but yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll speak very loudly. Even in Merleau-Ponty, though, in the chapter on sexuality and the phenomenology of perception, there's still much starch with it. There's still alterations of sadism and masochism, where I think in the later work, in the philosophy of the flesh, that there would be less inclination for that.
Well, do you think that perversion escapes the game of eroticism?
No, what I'm thinking is, I mean, this constant description of sex is not that different from Sartreism being in nothingness. It's a question of progressive objectification, of transferring objectification, and so on.
But Sartre is not Merleau-Ponty. I think that if we take the trio, Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Merleau-Ponty, in my opinion, among those three, the one who really has most to tell us today precisely in the kind of perspective we are here for is Merleau-Ponty, I think. Because precisely Sartre and Beauvoir go for this confusion of object of and object. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir, if you read the Second Sex, with that thread, you see it every 2 pages. There is this constant, you know, really slippery equivalence. Object of, and it becomes flesh, it becomes passivity, it becomes mass, the female anatomy, the woman. I mean, it's pornography, Simone de Beauvoir read today. It's offensive. I used to read Simone de Beauvoir as if it were, you know, a sacred text. Read it today. But she enjoys too much talking about women like this. She enjoys it too much. It's disturbing. This immanence, women have no subjectivity, they don't exist, they are empâtés dans l'immanence. I mean, miring in paste, in immanence, makeup, this way of making yourself an artificial object. You are hypernatural, but at the same time you make yourself hyper-artificial, and everything turns to the same thing. It is a sort of, you know, a sort of powerful destiny which is cast there for a woman. And this is what Simone de Beauvoir shares with Sartre, with the novels, with the nausea, with these women who are there and do nothing, they are fat and immobile. I mean, the misogyny of those pages is, for me, read today, after the historical role that all that thinking has had, which has been wonderful and fantastic. But now I think we can afford to shed that kind of Kantian thinking. Yes, at least this is my own little fight.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your paper a lot. So my question is about I suppose, the status of human-animal difference in your overall reading. So if kind of one of the clear features of Kant's account, as you've presented, is that he denies the possibility of an erotic connection between humans and animals. Certainly in a condemnation of bestiality, but on other levels of his thought as well, kind of just denying a substantial connection between humans and animals in, say, the psychic life of a human, or certainly in the moral life of a human. So if in moving away from Kant to, say, a different paradigm, I just wonder if that human-animal difference also dissolves away if we move away from that. So I guess my question is, in kind of the erotics, or the sense of erotics that you propose, is there a human-animal erotics? If not, why not? And if there is, if in moving from Kant you open the possibility for that, what does that look like, and maybe what are some of the implications of that?
I think that the only thing I could tell you about this is that in a sense my philosophical allegiance goes to the Epicurean Freudian tradition. So I think that Epicurus, the great tradition of hedonism, utilitarianism, Hobbes and Freud, this is where I feel at home, personally, since you asked me. Therefore, this is where I would think the question of how human and non-human living being can meet on the terrain, let's say, of pleasure and pain. And this is exactly what Kant doesn't allow you to do, because, of course, for him, something that I didn't say that doesn't go without saying is that, of course, Kant frameworks is right, of course, is right. So the metaphysics of morals is about the legal symbolization and structure of human life, and it is in that context that he speaks about marriage, and it is in that context, therefore, that he speaks about sexuality. So in that context, what really matters for Kant is to make sure that the categories at work are not pleasure and pain. He's not interested in that at all. Whereas it has been shown that he had a very strong, precisely, interest for the Epicureans, and I think that kind of Epicurean, this paradoxical Epicurean, who is Lucretius, who never speaks about pleasure, except barely in the first line of the poem, and in 2 or 3 other places, but it has been recently shown by a young French scholar, you know, how really distorted is Epicureanism through Lucretius. That is the Lucretius, the kind of Epicureanism that Kant could like, but other than that, Kant doesn't care about pleasure, okay, precisely for all the reasons we know. If there is a space, it seems to me, where really we can even think in terms of reciprocity between non-human and human living beings, that pleasure and pain. This is why I said at the beginning, with reciprocity and recognition is something that can happen across species, but not intersubjectivity. I don't know. I mean, I throw it like this. I don't know if you would.
And so therefore, perhaps not erotics.
Well, erotics, I don't know. I suspend my belief about that. But,
Thank you very much, all.